Hello, beautiful community. Big bombing in Moscow over the weekend. So I'm going to give us a quick 30,000 feet analytical take on it. The target seems to have been Mr. Chaiko, who is the head of Russia's aerospace forces since the last few weeks. And allegedly, he seems to have been celebrating his 55th birthday at a plush restaurant privately booked for this event on the bottom floor of a Stalin-era high-rise right in the center of Moscow. It seems like Mr. Chaiko survived, but there were casualties and fatalities both among the FSO, the Federal Protection Service, and among Mr. Chaiko's family. Our information is fragmentary, but it seems like the husband of his daughter may have lost his life and his daughter was injured. A courier who didn't know presumably what they were carrying brought an explosive device that went off on the veranda, not inside the restaurant, which would have generated more casualties. What's the politics of this? Well, a few obvious remarks. First of all, informationally, the Russians are interested in blaming Ukraine, but not blaming Ukraine too loudly, because going on about this exposes their failure and their incapacity to prevent this. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are interested in not taking responsibility for this too loudly, because this generates conspiratorial reflections about whether this may have been internally generated in Russia, and that's the sort of thing Ukraine wants. To a domestic audience in Ukraine, this is a signal of agency and capacity to project power on Russian territory. To Ukraine's Western supporters, it's a signal about Ukraine's capacity to pressure the Putin regime and project power not just inside Russian territory, but inside the epicenter of Russia's elites. If the bombing of Mr. Tatarsky in 2023 was a kind of attack on the soldier/mill blogger niche, this was an attack on the sort of epicenter of the social life of people high up in the military and high up in the regime. So this takes us to the interesting bits of analysis now. Mr. Rubio said a short while ago that he felt that Ukraine's attacks on Russian soil might bring about peace negotiations. Is this true? No. Is this true in the mind of the actors involved in the situation? No. Right? This is not in Mr. Putin's mind going to bring him any closer to a peace negotiation, nor is it in Mr. Zelensky's mind going to do this either. So the public story about Ukraine's projection of power over the last few weeks on Russian territory on a more dramatic scale, the public story about how that's a way of bringing Russia to the negotiating table, is certainly not a story Mr. Zelensky privately believes in. Right? So Mr. Zelensky is not thinking, wow, this could bring the Russians to a negotiating table. Largely, the schematic negotiating predicament now is imitative, because there is nothing that the West and Ukraine are able to offer Russia that the Kremlin would accept, and there is nothing that the Kremlin is able to offer us that we would find acceptable, that Ukrainians would find sustainable or acceptable. So there is an unbridgeable gulf there that's certainly not going to be diminished or bridged by these sorts of operations. Next point. An important aspiration here is, of course, the destabilization of Putin's regime. The late Mr. Pavlovsky, Gleb Pavlovsky, used to work for the Kremlin and was in many ways, well, we shouldn't be overestimated, but it was a contributor to the sort of authorship of the informational and propagandistic behavior of the regime. Mr. Pavlovsky, of course, then left the regime and was a vehement critic of Putin's. But Mr. Pavlovsky used to talk about a blame game that is played inside the regime, that's a way for the regime to eat itself up. And the blame game is that something is going wrong and somebody needs to be blamed, but with one proviso, that the person actually to blame, Mr. Putin, can't be named. And so the regime goes on gobbling bits of itself up and then substituting the bits it's gobbled up in a blame game in which the actual person to blame is unnameable. That's the sort of thing the Zelensky administration is going for with this kind of attack. Now, perhaps the most interesting point of all. Why are they having parties like this when they know about Ukraine's reach? And if they're having parties like this, why aren't they able to secure them properly and secure their key assets properly? So at least symbolically what this shows is that the consequences of the war that the Putin regime is engaging in, right, are running ahead of the shape of the Putin regime. Its war is generating consequences for which the regime is itself not yet ready. We saw this kind of predicament that the regime, a similar predicament the regime faced in 2022, when it started a war that, had it gone as well as Putin had delusionally hoped it might go, if it had gone that well, it would have been a palatable enterprise, the full-scale invasion in 2022, if it genuinely turned out to be a kind of a semi-coup that Putin wanted to orchestrate without proper war. If it turned out to be that, then the regime could have retained its previous shape. It could have retained its shape as an informational autocracy. Plenty of articles and books have been written about this, but very roughly, according to that jargon, an informational autocracy is a regime that can afford to start wars that it can take out of the informational environment at will, but it can't start wars that it can't take out of the informational environment that is simply going to absorb it. And so the regime suddenly found itself in an enterprise for which it wasn't ready, so it needed to take a series of authoritarian and maybe even totalitarian turns. There is a kind of lag of a similar kind appearing in 2026. The totalization of the war, the increased symmetry of the war, with the war coming onto Russian soil more dramatically than ever, the regime in its shape is running behind the kind of consequences that its own war is generating. And this really feeds into the heart of the biggest analytical challenge for the most legit and sophisticated Western Russia experts. Right? There's a lot of people on the expert circuit who don't know what they're talking about. That's not the point. But the point is that there are people who are absolutely wonderful and have a great grasp of Russia, whether they're from an academic background or some other kind of background, but they're a very important part of how we get Russia. And I think these very best people are still struggling at the moment with something that is genuinely difficult, and that is the question of the flexibility of the Putin's regime and its need and capacity to evolve. Historically, it's a feature of the Putin regime that it is remarkably malleable. It has a Hydra-like capacity to somehow be free to take on forms discontinuous with its own previous forms, on the one hand. And so that remarkable flexibility is an important feature of the regime. At the same time, it is losing that remarkable flexibility. And so in the midst of this, it's really difficult to judge how flexible and how brittle the regime is, and what its latest shape is. There's always a tendency to think of the regime in terms of where it was a few years ago rather than where it is today. So this hits, and I'll talk about this specifically over the coming weeks, into not a blind spot, but a kind of a core interpretive difficulty of the best Western Russia expertise. And I think we're thrust into that kind of epistemic challenge for the expert community by the fact that events like this demonstrate that the consequences of the war that the regime is prosecuting, that these consequences are generating a predicament for which the regime is not set up. and that the regime needs to evolve, take further authoritarian, totalitarian turns to adjust to this, but it also is enormously reluctant to take these too quickly, and it hopes that before it has to take too many of them, there is some kind of democratic collapse in France, Germany, and the UK, and a political collapse in Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. On that conversation goes, but I wanted to raise this topic in relation to that event for you. Forgot to say, main channel video, 7 p.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, UK time. Make sure you are subscribed and clickified on the bell button, because it's going to get off to a really slow start, because we haven't met there for about 2 or 3 months. So see you then.